Umbreon is another of the more technical decks in eCard. It requires a knowledge of the metagame and the ability to make decisions based on your opponent's gameplay perspective. This aspect of the gameplay coming primarily from Aquapolis Umbreon's Dark Moon Pokepower. For the number of darkness energy you have attached to Umbreon, once per turn you can look at your opponent's hand and shuffle that many cards from their hand back into their deck, and then they draw that many cards. Essentially, you're looking at your opponent's hand and going, oh yeah, this card and this card, they're going to be really helpful to you next turn, so I'm going to make sure you don't have access to those. The balance here comes from the fact that they do get to draw cards to replace those cards you just sent back into their deck, and the hope is that they don't draw anything as useful as what you discarded. Which is why I said a knowledge of the metagame is kind of necessary, because you need to know what is going to be most beneficial for your opponent so that you can make sure that that trade-off is worthwhile, that you are sending cards into their deck that they're going to miss, and line up your choice of reshuffle cards in your opponent's hand to the disruption you have planned based on what you already have in your hand. Speaking of forms of disruption, Shadow Bind is a trapping attack. With a darkness energy attached, it's going to do base 40. With a couple, it's going to do base 50 for 3, which is pretty good. But it's also going to trap the opposing Pokemon in the active position until your opponent can draw a switch or a warp point, which you can actually make sure that they don't have one of those in their hand by using Umbreon's Dark Moon power. Another form of disruption comes from the Skyridge Umbreon, which has the Dark Gaze Pokebody. As long as this Umbreon is in your active position, benched Pokemon can't use Pokepowers, so this is an Umbreon that you are going to whip out whenever you notice that your opponent is playing any archetype that relies on benched power support, so your Furrets, Clefable, Porygon 2, Machamp. Within the first couple of turns, your opponent's going to be trying to get those Pokemon set up on the bench, so as soon as you see a Sentret, or a Porygon, or a Machop, you know that you're going to be searching out this Umbreon instead of the Aquapolis one. Sharp Claws isn't nearly as good of an attack, but the card makes up for it in the type of disruption it can provide against those decks that rely on bench support. Disruption and Control are the bread and butter for this deck, and it is a nice change-up to have this type of deck relevant in the eCard metagame. It's not just evolve and attach a bunch of energy and overrun your opponent. Umbreon provides an answer to those decks that are heavy on support Pokemon. Umbreon is kind of a counter to every way of thinking we've discussed in eCard so far, and that's going to become apparent as we get into the deck list, so let's go ahead and do that. Of course, we are starting out this deck list with a full playset of Charge Up Eevee. If you're lucky on your first attacking turn and you hit heads on that charge up, next turn you're looking at swinging in a fully powered Shadow Bind with the special energy card attached. You're going to have at least one darkness energy already just from the charge up. And hitting a turn 2 Shadow Bind is extremely difficult to get out of for your opponent, because you have this presumably basic Pokemon in the active position that has taken 40 damage and you can't retreat it. So your options are try to draw into some type of switch card, or abandon that Pokemon and just try to set up something on your bench while the active gets sacrificed to another Umbreon attack. All the while, that setup's going to be pretty difficult to establish when that Umbreon is also using its power to look at your hand and remove cards that it doesn't like. Plus, just being able to look at your opponent's hand once per turn is pretty helpful. So we're running 3 copies of the Aquapolis Umbreon, 1 copy of the Skyridge Umbreon, and 1 copy of Espeon to help cover Umbreon's fighting weakness just in case you run into a Donphan or a Machamp. Espeon's just such a good card in its own right. And Energy Return can be super helpful from time to time. There's also a full playset of Stantler in here just because we need more than 4 basics in this deck, and Stantler is one of the few basics that does offer a similar disruptive strategy to what Umbreon's already doing. For 1 colorless, you can use Threaten, flip a coin if heads, look for a trainer card in your opponent's hand, and shuffle it back into their deck. Not stupendous by any means, but it is an alternative basic for starting the game, though ideally you do want to start with an Eevee so that you can attempt to hit that charge up, get everything moving as quickly as possible. The sooner you get all of these disruptive factors in place, the more frustrated your opponent's going to be, the more control you have over what your opponent can actually do on their turn, and generally a higher ability to make them scoop on turn 4. The draw power is going to be coming from 3 copies of Professor Oak's Research and 3 copies of Underground Expedition. And you may be thinking like, well, your opponent's going to mulligan a lot. You want to put Copycat in here? Wrong! You want to put Desert Shaman in here because you don't want your opponent to have a lot of resources in their hand. If your opponent's got 6 or 7 cards in hand, Umbreon shuffling back a couple of them isn't going to impact their gameplay as much. But if you reduce their hand size back down to 4 after they've taken a few mulligans, and then you start sending cards from their hand back into their deck to get reshuffled, and they can hopefully, just try to draw back what they want, that's where the real sense of control sets in, and that's where the scoopage starts to happen. 4 copies of Professor Elm's training method just so you can search out those Umbreons as quickly as possible. Because there are so few Pokemon lines being run in this deck, you can fully utilize the ball engine, which I generally prefer over the Pokemon Fan Club Pedalm combo just to get all of the Pokemon cards that you need. But the ball engine is just so much faster when you're working with a more streamlined Pokemon setup, just because they're all trainer cards. If you've got 5 balls in your hand, you can play them all on that turn and get 5 different Pokemon. Instead of using 1 supporter card, like Pokemon Fan Club, and getting 2 Pokemon, you can use your supporter slot for Apricorn Maker, which lets you search out 2 balls, which are in turn then going to get you 2 more Pokemon, allowing you to thin your deck by 4 cards instead of 2, which is ultimately better for streamlining your top draws. For this ball engine, we got a full playset of Dual Ball to grab basics out of your deck, just a couple copies of Fastball for evolution cards since we've already got the full playset of Professor Elm's training method, 3 copies of Master Ball just to take a peek and see what's in the top 7 cards of your deck, and get a basic or evolution card, and pretty much any way you chain these, you're going to get exactly what you need. As for the other forms of disruption in this deck, a full playset of Energy Removal 2, so that once you strand a Pokemon in the active position and your opponent starts setting up something on the bench, you go, nuh-uh, nope, you're not attaching energy to stuff on there, get that out of here. And then 3 copies of Pokemon Reversal so that you can try to strand a Pokemon of your choice in the active position. A lot of reliance on coin flips for these disruption cards, but they still make your opponent sweat, whether or not you actually hit that coin flip or not. Full playset of Special Darkness Energy, of course that's going to be vital to actually using Aquapolis Umbreon's power. As backup, there's also a full playset of Rainbow Energy. It's not only going to provide Darkness Energy for when you can't grab the Special Dark, or if they're all in the discard, or if you just want to pull out that Espeon and fire off a Damage Blast attack. 3 copies of Cyclone Energy just as another gusting mechanic to really just mess with your opponent's board state. And then we'll top off the deck with 4 Psychic Energy, which are there purely for the Espeon, but, Umbreon's going to be attacking with Colorless Energy as well, so might as well be basic energy that can also benefit the Espeon. As discussed earlier, ideally you are starting with an Eevee, and ideally hitting heads on a charge up, searching for a Special Dark and attaching it to Eevee that way. On your second turn, you're good to go. You have your win condition fully set up. But it ain't always going to happen that way. Even if you are starting with a Stantler though, it's a 1 energy attacker with 60 HP, not a lot's going to be able to knock it out, and you are able to start the disruption from the get-go while you get the rest of your setup on the bench. So even then, it's not a bad start, just not the start. With all of the disruptive trainers in this deck, there's not really room for Power Charge, which you would normally see in a deck that has a lot of special energy cards in it. You can make room for it, but I don't really think it's necessary because you do have Espeon as another one of your tools in this deck. It's not just a coverage attacker, there's a lot of utility in its energy return poke power. If your active Umbreon is going to get knocked out next turn, and you're not going to be dealing enough damage to get a KO on your turn, then you might as well just return a Darkness Energy attached to it to your hand to use on another Umbreon, rather than letting it go to the discard. This can get tricky since the Skyridge Umbreon is also going to block energy return on your own bench. But as long as you don't have both of those Pokemon out at the same time, there's not a problem. And there's not really a reason that you would have both of them out. Other builds of this deck will opt to use some more evolution coverage. Flareon for your Scizors, or a Vaporeon for your Typhlosion and other fire decks, but the more Pokemon you include in this deck, the less powerful the ball engine becomes. So you really have to be aware of that trade-off and weigh if it's actually necessary or beneficial for you. The last thing I will say about this deck is that you do not need to be using Dark Moon every turn, because if your opponent just has bad cards in their hand, they're going to want you to use Dark Moon so that they can get rid of something. When you use Dark Moon, you have to take something from their hand and put it back in their deck. You can't choose 0 cards. So just be attentive, be smart, and notice if your opponent is giving any signs about what they have in their hand before you even look at it. If they've been holding on to the same 4 cards the entire game, it's probably because they can't use those 4 cards. If they're at a point where they just attach an energy and pass turn, yeah, you don't need to be using Dark Moon because they've already got a bad enough hand. Any disruption you do is probably going to help them. And once you've used Dark Moon a couple of times early game, you get a pretty good handle of what your opponent has been holding on to in their hand. You just have to remember, okay, 2 turns ago when I looked at their hand, they had this and this and this. Since then, they've played this and this. And you just use basic logic to determine, okay, yeah, they're holding on to those few cards that they can't use. I'm just going to make sure that they continue to keep those in their hand. That is what's best for my side of the field. That is what's best for making sure my opponent does not gain an advantage. This is something that's a lot easier to gauge in person because you can read gestures and facial expressions. But when you're playing on like TCG1 where you can't actually see the other person, this deck does become a little bit worse because of that. Well, the deck doesn't necessarily get worse, but your ability to read your opponent and make decisions on whether or not a Dark Moon is appropriate is impacted. And that is eCard Umbreon. As always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Let me know any eCard request decks you may have on your mind. Do all the YouTube stuff, like likes and comments. It all helps me get into the algorithm and spread more retro TCG content out there into the tubes. Social media links in the description. I'm usually pretty responsive to anybody that hits me up via those outlets. And I'll see you next video.